Welcome everyone to the next installment of our distinguished lecture series. It's my pleasure to be here and to introduce Professor Renjie Liao. Professor Liao comes to us from the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering and Computer Science at the University of British Columbia. He's also a faculty member at the Spectral Institute and the Canada CIFAR AI Chair. Before joining UBC, he was a visiting faculty researcher at Google Brain, working with Jeff Hinton and Dave Fleet. He got his PhD at the University of Toronto in 2021 under supervision of Rich Zemmel and Raquel Risson. He also worked at Uber during his PhD. So I don't want to take up any of our precious time here. We're going to pass it off now to Professor Liao. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank Dan for the nice introduction. I'm very happy and honored to give a talk at Vector to discuss some of our recent research on using spectral graph theory to improve graph neural networks. So first of all, let's look at some motivating applications of graphs. So graphs are prevalent in scientific and engineering applications. For example, in molecule property prediction and molecule generation, people try to represent the graphs either as a kind of planar graphs or as a 3D graphs with, those with coordinates in the 3D space. And then you can describe the molecules in this compact structure. And then in the social networks, people represent the whole network as a graph and then perform a lot of tasks like, for example, need prediction, predicting whether two users have a certain relationships on the network. And also in network-based recommendation system, we have a graph among users and items, and then we need to infer for individual user which items are more likely to be favored by the user. And not surprisingly, graph neural networks as a representative approach in deep learning excel at modeling graph data. Let's first quickly review what graph neural networks are. So give graph data, for example, represented as the Jensen matrix A and node feature X, we can process it with a graph neural network. So here you can understand node feature as a vector per node. So you can pay attention to the small vector here per node. So you can stack them together as a node feature matrix, but for visualization, it's better to understand them as a vector representation per node. And then you pass it to a so-called message passing module, which takes the Jensen matrix A and node feature X as input, and then give you an updated node representation or node vectors per node. And then you repeat this procedure many, many times, and then you apply some readout module to do classification or regression on the node, edge, and or graph level. And the important thing is for graph neural networks, the message passing module itself is typically permutation equivariant. By that, I mean, if we apply a permutation, for example, represented by this permutation matrix P, you can permute the order of vertices, and then it amounts to left multiply the permutation matrix P on the Jensen matrix A, and then P transpose on the right. And then similarly, on node feature, you will left multiply the permutation matrix P, and it's the same as you do not apply the permutation and go through the message passing module and then apply the permutation to the updated node representations. So this is what permutation equivariance means. And most of the GN preserve this equivariance. And furthermore, you can build the permutation invariance at graph level by some global pooling operator, for example, average or max, on top of the permutation equivariance architecture. So you can see that this architecture is very useful and expressive because you can easily build permutation equivariant node function and permutation invariant to graph functions. On the other hand, spectral graph theory as a branch of mathematics studies graph properties like characteristic polynomials, eigenvalues, and eigenvectors of matrices like graph Laplacian or Jensen matrix, which are associated with the graph. So here are two kind of classic textbooks in this area, written by Fan Chun and Daniel Spearman. And in this area, there are tons of important results. For example, the eigenvalues and graph collectivity, Chigger's inequality, spectral partitioning, clustering, Courant feature theorem, so on and so forth. And in this talk, I will see that some of the tools are instrumental in improving GNs. So in particular, we're gonna talk about two perspectives. First is how to use spectral graph theory to improve practical GN design. And the second is how the spectral graph theory helps us understand the theoretical part of GN better. In particular, I'm gonna talk about two work. One is published like here last year, and the other is still under submission. Okay, so the first work is called SpecFormer, Spectral Graph Neural Networks Meet Transformers. So it's a work led by my visiting PhD student, Deyu Bo from BUPT, and his supervisor, Professor Chuan Shi, and my colleagues, Nele Wang. Okay, before we started, let's quickly review what Fourier transform and the traditional convolution does. For example, give a signal in time, ft, the classic Fourier transform the time domain signal into the frequency domain, which basically represent function in terms of the complex exponentials. So one of the important collection or finding is with Laplacian operator, we can actually kind of derive the Fourier transform. So the idea is as follows. So first, the definition of Laplacian operator is this kind of divergence operator of the gradient. In this concrete example, is kind of the second partial derivative with respect to time. And then if we apply this Laplacian operator to the complex exponentials shown up in the Fourier transform, you will find something similar to what you learned in the linear algebra. So for example, in the finite dimensional vector space, you can view the Laplacian operator as a matrix, and then the complex exponential you can view it as a vector, V. And then you have a matrix multiplied a vector on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, you will have a scalar lambda multiply another same vector, V. So this is precisely the definition of eigenvalue and eigenvectors. So in other words, the complex exponential is the eigenfunction of the Laplacian operator. And that's an important collection or finding, because then we can leverage this finding to introduce Fourier transforms and convolution on graphs. So first of all, we need a so-called Laplacian operator on graph. So what are they? So give a graph like showing in the picture, and we also show the Jensen matrix. And then we can first compute this degree matrix. So the idea is you sum over the elements per row and then put it on diagonal, and that diagonal matrix is a degree matrix. And then you can define a so-called combinatorial graph Laplacian. So the intuition behind this operator is basically use the sum of your neighbors, subtract the individual neighbors. It's kind of a difference operator in the discrete case. But this matrix is not convenient to work with because the eigenvalues can be unbounded. And then people typically use symmetrically normalized graph Laplacian, which has this form. This Laplacian matrix has a few less properties. For example, the eigenvalues lies in the range 0 to 2. And moreover, we have this spectral theorem that tells us for symmetric matrix, we can decompose it into this form where U is the matrix containing the eigenvectors as columns, and lambda is the diagonal matrix with eigenvalues on the diagonal. By that, now we can introduce the so-called graph Fourier transform, because we already introduced Laplacian operator, and then we try to find eigenfunction and use eigenfunction as a basis to expand the signal. Here we talk about graph signal and the node feature interchangeably. So you can imagine each node has a vector representation, and that vector is so-called signal. And then we can define first the graph Fourier transform, which basically is as simple as U transpose multiply the signal X. And this is the case because U as eigenvectors of graph Laplacian matrix exactly mimic the eigenfunctions of graph Laplacian operator we talked about before, but in the finite dimension space. And then similarly, we can introduce the inverse graph Fourier transform, which simply multiply U. With these tools, we can now introduce so-called graph convolution. So the idea is as follows. You first do the graph Fourier transform, and then everything is now transformed into the frequency domain. And then you do a spectral filter, which is this function h theta applied to the diagonal matrix, which contains the eigenvalues. And then you do the inverse graph Fourier transform so that you go back to the time domain. And the important thing is in this kind of framework, the eigenvalues correspond to frequencies. Let's take a look at what this process visually looks like. So suppose now you are given a graph like this, and then you give a one-dimensional graph signal, okay, just a scalar basically. And if this red bar is pointing up, it means this signal itself is positive. If it is pointing down, means the signal is negative. Then you have this graph data, and then you first apply the graph Fourier transform, which is basically U transpose X, and then you get a signal per node. And then you apply the spectral filters. So in this case, I'm using a basically low pass filter, which preserves the low frequency, but filter out the high frequency. And then after the filtering, I get a new representation, but in the frequency domain, and then I apply the inverse graph Fourier transform. I can get the signal back in the time domain. From the effect, you can see that you basically smooth out the signal across the nodes in the graph. Okay, so in graph convolution literature, most paper use spectral filters that are element-wise. So what does that mean? It means that you apply a function to individual eigenvalues, and that function is shared across different eigenvalues. So no dependency among eigenvalues is captured via such a spectral filter. For example, the famous graph convolution network, GCN, use a linear filter, and then Chebyshev use the Chebyshev polynomials, and then the Nenchus network use a neural network parameterized filters. So they are all element-wise. But on the other hand, we know that the set of eigenvalues, also known as spectrum, as a whole, give us a lot of information. For example, if we rank all the eigenvalues in the ascending order, we know that the smallest one must be 0 because the corresponding eigenvector is 1, or 1 vector. And the second, the smallest eigenvalue is called the algebraic collectivity, also known as feather value. If this lambda 2, the feather value is 0, it means that your graph is discollected. If it's non-zero, it means that your graph is collected. And moreover, we can actually know the number of collected components. So the number of collected components is just the algebraic multiplicity of the eigenvalue 0. In other words, you just count how many eigenvalues equal to 0, and that counting number will be a number of collected components. And at the same time, you can bound the diameter of a collected graph using the feather value and the largest eigenvalue of the graph Laplacian. And moreover, you can also bound the conductance, and even in the deregular graph case, you can find the sparse cuts based on the second smallest eigenvalue. And this is the famous Chigurh's inequality. So all these nice results from the spectral theory, spectral graph theory tells us the eigenvalue as a whole site tells us more information rather than individual eigenvalue. Because if you feed the individual eigenvalue to the neural network, the neural network cannot easily know, okay, which eigenvalue it is, like whether it's the second smallest, like whether it's the smallest. You need to compare different eigenvalues, and then the neural network can start to learn such information. And that's exactly the motivation. We want the neural network to leverage the right subset of eigenvalues to learn such properties. And graphically, what does that mean? It means that our spectral filter, in order to get the filter, the new eigenvalue lambda 1 prime, it needs to like take all the eigenvalues as input. And it must be permutation equivariant, because no matter how I change the order of eigenvalue, the second smallest eigenvalue still stays the same. So the output new eigenvalues, filtered eigenvalues should be permuted accordingly. And then second, it must be expressive. For example, I would like to represent all possible functions over the set of eigenvalues. And the answer to achieve such properties is not surprising. So we can use architecture, which is pretty much like a transformer to achieve such properties. So how can we do that? So we introduce this Spectral Gen. So with the side-to-side spectral filters, sorry, we can introduce the details component by component. So first of all, we have a bunch of eigenvalues of graph Laplacian as input, and it represents a bunch of scalars on the frequency axis, you can see here. But if you directly feed the scalars into neural networks, the neural network is not so happy, and it can't effectively learn to capture the relationship between them. So what we found very useful practice is we can borrow the idea of positional encoding from the standard transformer, but with a very important difference here. In positional encoding, you encode the index of the ordering of your tokens, but here you can't just encode the index, because encoding the index will break the permutation equivariance. So instead, what we do is we encode the eigenvalue magnitude, or the actual value, as the positional encoding input, and then we get a vector output per eigenvalue. So by doing so, we basically allow neural network to treat each eigenvalue as a different vector, and then try to do self-attention later on to figure out the relationship, and then try to leverage the proper useful information from the spectrum. And apparently it's equivalent to permutation, because this eigenvalue encoding doesn't depend on the order at all. And then we use basically standard transformer encoder blocks with Martin-Head attention, and then we have a decoder module, which we decode the token representation, where token here is individual eigenvalues from a small attention module. So this will give us some new eigenvalues. We call it filtered eigenvalue. And based on the filtered eigenvalue, we construct the new graph Laplacian matrix. And then we can just perform regular graph convolution with the new graph Laplacian matrix. And that is basically the structure of our specformer model. And our model is permutation equivariant, because all these modules like eigenvalue encoding, transformer, graph convolution, all these modules are like permutation equivariant. And moreover, we generalize the previous literature of element-wise spectral filters, because now we can map a set of eigenvalue to a set of new eigenvalues. And moreover, we can show that our side-to-side is function is universal, because basically we follow the deep sides like the blueprints to prove that, which use this Kolmogorov-Arlov theorem for the multivariate function. And more recently, people like Lingham et al. Build new architectures which are further invariant to sign flips of eigenvectors. This is important because here we only consider eigenvalues, but eigenvectors are also useful, and more importantly, eigenvectors are they span the same eigenspace, although with different sign flips the space stays unchanged. So your model should be invariant to such sign flips. So this is another interesting direction to look into. Okay, so let's look at some experiments. So in this synthetic experiment, we are given the image and we know a bunch of handcrafted spectral filters, for example, low pass, high pass, band pass, so on and so forth. And then we try to learn such spectral filters to filter image and then recover the underlying true spectral filters. And from all these experiments, you can see that our model achieves the best recovery performance, like the square error and R2 score. If you look at the actual recovered filter shape, so you can see that our model gives the shape which is faithfully like matching the ground truth. The ground truth is in black, but the other competitors have compromised the shape in some places, some frequency band. And if you look at the image, you also can see that our performance is closer to the ground truth, which is the filter image by a handcrafted spectral filter. We also extensively test our model on a lot of real-world node classification tasks. At that time, we achieved the state-of-the-art on most of the benchmarks, and more importantly, our model actually is smaller in terms of number of parameters compared to the other state-of-the-art graph neural networks. And then we also test on a lot of graph level regression classification tasks on a lot of benchmarks. And these are much larger data sets, and you can see that at that time we also achieved state-of-the-art on most of them. And more interestingly, if we look at the attention pattern, so for example, in this top left subfigure, we can see that when the underlying spectral filter is low pass, you see that the attention module, so we interpret this row-wise, so no frequency band pay more attention to no frequency band, and similar things holds for medium frequency band and high frequency band. So this makes a lot of sense for the low pass filter, because in this case, you just want to preserve the low frequency and filter out the high frequency. And our work released the code on the GitHub, and if you're interested, feel free to try it out. Okay, now I'm going to move to the second piece of the work, which touches about understanding the generalization behavior of graph neural networks. It's called in-distribution and size generalization for graph neural networks. It's done with the master student, Emmanuel Salis, co-supervised by me and Nick Harvey. So in traditional generalization theory of machine learning, people talk about in-distribution generalization, where your underlying assumption is your data is IID, meaning, for example, in this image classification example, your input image and label pair are drawn from an unknown distribution independently. And Pike bias is one type of generalization theory. It assumes a prior over the hypothesis class. So what does hypothesis class mean? It means the class or the set of models you are going to learn from. So for example, a concurrent cases, you specify the architecture of a neural net. Then all possible neural networks with this architecture is the set of hypotheses you want to learn from. And then how to understand the prior over the hypothesis class? You can understand the way that in the beginning of training, you initialize the weights by sampling the weights from some, say, standard normal distribution. And then that standard normal distribution over weights give you a prior over this hypothesis class. And then you throw these two to the learning algorithm, for example, stochastic gradient descent. And then in the Pike bias view, you will get a posterior distribution over the hypothesis class H. And in Pike bias theory, the classical results is with probability at least 1 minus delta over this size M IID training set S. According to distribution D, we have this inequality. So on the left-hand side, we have the expected testing loss. On the right-hand side, we have the training loss plus a generalization gap. And you can see that in the generalization gap, it depends on the KL divergence of the posterior and the prior and the sample size. And many people have worked on this area, and in particular, like for example, Carolina and Dan has some nice work in this area. So the question we have is, can we generalize such packet-based theory to graph data and graph neural networks? And the answer is yes. So in this work, the authors show that with probability at least 1 minus delta, again, we have generalization bound for the GCN, the graph convolutional networks with L layers and maximum node degree D. So you don't need to care about the full inequality. Instead, pay attention to the quantity in the red box, because in this work, we improve it. We improve the quantities in the red box significantly, which are shown in the blue box. We basically use a better induction argument and a better metric concentration inequality to achieve this. And you can see that the dependency on the node degree D is improved a lot, because previously it's D to the power of L minus 1, where L is the depth of a neural network. Right now it's just D. So in summary, we compare with all the previous results in this area, for example, the VC dimension and the Riemann complexity-based bounds for graph neural networks. You can see that we improve the dependency on the maximum node degree. We basically make it linear, and then we also improve the dependency on the maximum hidden dimension, which is the width, maximum width of your network. But all these results are still in distribution, meaning your training and testing distributions are the same. But at the same time, we care about OOD generalization. OOD generalization wants to give criterions when testing distribution is different from training. And there exists a vast literature on this topic and the various setups and assumptions. And we consider a particular setup which is important for graph neural networks, which is called size generalization. So the idea is as follows. We assume the graphs are sampled as random walk induced subgraphs on a giant collected deregular graph. So in particular, we will assume the random walk size during training is n, and the random walk size during testing is m, and m is much larger than n. So what does that look like in graphically? Suppose you have a giant social network. And now you uniformly pick a node like this one, and then simulate a random walk. So the random walk will be like the path pointed by these arrows. And after you finish the random walk with a certain length, you grab the induced subgraph, which is this one, as your training graph or test graph. And the difference between training graph and test graph is the length of the induced, the length of the random walks are different. And the testing random walks are much longer than the training ones. And then we assume we care about the binary graph classification with arbitrary node labeling function, but preferably exhibit homophilic properties, and we'll talk about what that means exactly later on. And based on the node labeling, we can get a graph labeling by, for example, majority voting. And this majority voting actually give you the homophilic property. And then the third assumption is when you have a test size m induced subgraph, since m is much larger than n, you need to sample a size n induced subgraph for testing, because otherwise it will run out of memory. And a few notes about our assumption. First, we don't have explicit assumptions on graph distributions. So the underlying giant network can come from arbitrary graph distributions. And then second, we don't have assumptions on node labeling. So node labeling can also be arbitrary, but the majority voting will make sure that the homophilic property is still the case. And this homophilic property is actually very realistic in many of the social network setups. Okay, before we present our results, let's get some key intuition of our results. So let's consider a kind of contrived example. Here you have a barbell graph. And on the left-hand side, you will have some nodes belong to one label, like, for example, positive. On the right-hand side, they belong to negative. Sorry. And why I call this graph is a contrived example is because now the node labeling coincides with the so-called sparses cut. So what does sparses cut mean? So we want to find a partition which is no larger than half of the size of the graph, meaning the number of nodes, such that the number of edges collecting two partitions divided by the size of one partition is the minimum. So basically, we want the edges across partitions as fewer as possible. And in this case, the node labeling exactly coincides with the sparses cut, which is cut in the middle. And then we have some observation. So the sparser the cut, the more likely the random walk is gonna stay within the same partition or labeling. And then if they stay in the same partition or labeling, the more likely the random walk induced subgraphs share the same neighbor, no matter how known the random walk is. So that's the key observation we have for this size generalization problem. Essentially, if you can bound the probability of random walks stay within the same partition, then you can essentially reduce this OOD problem to an in-distribution problem. And that's actually our key idea. But for now, we assume the sparses cut coincide with the node labeling, and we're gonna show a result first. And then we're gonna generalize to the case where the node labeling does not coincide with the sparses cut. So first of all, we need to use this famous Chigger's inequality. It tells us for the D-regular graph, it actually tells us the sparses cut upper bound and lower bound by the algebraic collectivity. And we can show that actually if the length of the testing random walk is no larger than this quantity, then the probability of the size M random walk crossing over the sparses cut partition at least once is at most delta. So meaning like if your M is less than this length, then it's very unlikely that your random walk gonna cross over the sparses cut. And if you don't cross over the sparses cut, then you can basically show that your OOD testing error gonna be no larger than the delta plus your size n expected testing error. And previously, we already derived Pike-based results for the same sized generalization. So basically, we can bound this second term on the right-hand side using our existing in-distribution generalization bound. And then you plus a delta, it gives you a OOD generalization bound. So this is our results in the case where your node labeling coincides with the sparses cut exactly, and we use this Chigger's inequality. Okay, so what happens if your node labeling does not coincide with the sparses cut? For example, you have an arbitrary node labeling phi vector, which give you a case like this. So this guy on the left-hand side has a different label than the other guys on the left-hand side. Right now, if you compute the sparses cut, it will not be the same as before. But fortunately, we can still leverage a tool from spectral graph theory, which is the Crown-Fisher theorem that gives us the variational characterization of eigenvalues. So again, we can look into the so-called Feidner value or algebraic collectivity, and then we can represent it as a solution to this constraint optimization problem. And on the right hand side, it's basically the Rayleigh quotient. So we can show that, again, if the length of the testing random walk is no larger than this quantity, then it's very unlikely that your random walk gonna cross over the sparses cut partition at least once. And now the difference being like, instead of directly depend on lambda 2, now it depends on a quantity alpha, which depends on the node labeling. And then similarly, we can show that the OOD generalization error, which is your expected testing error on the larger subgraph will be no larger than a delta plus the in-distribution generalization error, which is in the smaller size random walk induced graphs. So that's sorry, that's pretty much our results. And we have to say that this is a kind of the attempt in one such OD or size generalization setup. There are also other size generalization setups and worthwhile to look into. Okay, besides this work, I also want to briefly mention other work done in our lab, which also focus on graphs or structures in particular. For example, in this work, we have built a diffusion model for graph generation. And the key idea is you treat the Jensen matrix as a sort of image, and then you use a 2WLGN with some techniques to reduce the memory cost, and then you do this DDPM type of diffusion or EDM-based diffusion, and then you try to denoise the graph in the reverse process. And then we show that our model achieve like state-of-the-art results on most of the metrics on the molecule generation data set. Important thing is this code is already released, and you can take a look at some of the examples. So first, we try to generate graphs that are grid structure. So in this case, you can see that as diffusion process goes on, you basically have less noisy Jensen matrix, and the structure of the graph gradually emerge. The beginning is super dense because it's corresponding to a matrix with a Gaussian noise entry. And similarly, on the real-world data set, like protein graphs, you can see similar effect. In the beginning, it's super dense, and as the diffusion goes on, the protein structure gradually emerge. We also tried on the real-world molecule graphs, but this visualization is super hard to make it more readable because now you need to generate node tabs, the chemical, the atom tab, and also the edge tab, which is a chemical bond tab. But similarly, you can see that as time goes on in your reverse diffusion, the structure of the Jensen matrix gradually emerge, and the molecule graphs gradually become like stable, and then you get a bunch of molecules generated from your model. And in another work, we try to build a diffusion model on chord trees. So chord trees are a special kind of case of graphs, and it's heavily used in image processing and computer vision. So the idea is as follows. So you have an image, and then you split it into 4 equal parts. And if the pixels within the individual sub-image are very similar to each other, then you stop the division. Otherwise, you recursively divide the sub-image into another 4 parts, and then 4 sub-images, and then so on and so forth. So this provides basically a compression algorithm. In this case, we leverage this structure, and instead we define the diffusion process on the trees. As you can see here, if you are given a low resolution image, we can get a kind of shorter chord tree, and then we can use some interpolation to make it resized into a larger size, and then we add noise, and then we denoise, and accordingly on the trees you will see, sorry, on the trees you will see the representation being add noise and being denoised, and in the end you get a final clean image, and then you have a different shape called the tree. So this is laterally fitting to the problem of super resolution, because now you have a low resolution input and you want to get a high resolution output. And the last thing about diffusion model defined on the trees are that you can have a very sparse diffusion process. For example, if you look at the images in the bottom, now we don't add noise everywhere. We only add noise in the subregion that needs some further investigation, meaning the pixels within that sub image are very different to each other, then we add noise. If the pixels within the sub image that are very similar to each other, then we don't add noise. So in this case, we save a lot of computation and memory, and we still can get quite good results as the diffusion process proceeds. And this is still ongoing, and we hope to share with you more details later on. And then last, we also consider diffusion models on finite groups, in particular symmetric groups. Basically, the set of permutations complete with function composition. So the idea is as follows. So suppose you have an image, you split into a bunch of patches, and then you randomly permute the patches. For example, random swap them. You randomly pick a pair and then randomly swap them. And then as this process goes on, you will see that in the end, your patches, the permutation of them will follow the uniform distribution. That is your stationary distribution of the random walk. And this defines the forward process. And then in the reverse process, you use a neural network that learns to recover the true permutation. So one important thing here is we don't care about the pixel level output in the way that our neural network only output the permutation. We don't output the actual pixel values. So we're gonna apply the permutations output by neural network to the set of patches, and then we can shuffle the patches, and then we can recover the true image. So there is this intermediate kind of step that make the problem super hard, because your neural network can only output from the n factorial possible permutations. And you can see in this case, the neural network starts to learn to recover. Sorry. And it successfully recovered the true digits in MNIST. One thing I should mention that the neural network is conditioned on the shuffle, the digit image as input. And you can see that in the 2x2 cases, the performance is almost perfect. But in the 3x3 case, the performance drops significantly. And if you further increase the size of the permutation, like in 3x3 case, you have 9 factorial possible permutations, which is pretty large. But if you go to even larger applications, the space is even larger. So then how to improve the model is something we are trying to work on. Okay, so that's pretty much what I want to share with you. Thank you for listening. I'm happy to take some questions.
All right. All right. So let us see if, so we can ask for questions. People can either post in the chat or people can raise their hands. And I will call on you. I'll give a minute or so. Oh, someone has asked a question. Ping Ling has asked, I was wondering if you can talk a bit about the performance of spec formers, especially since they can have fewer parameters and in terms of speed and resources required.
Yeah, so, okay, let me go back to the slides where we talk about spec former. Yes, this yeah, this table is more detailed. So if you look at this column, it has the number of parameters of the model. So you can see that our model is has the least number of parameters, and it may be very important for such data set because data sets are not large anyway. So if you use a very large actually model, you will have overfitting or even out of memory. I mean, in this case, you can see the graphomer paper has actually run out of memory. So I guess the number of parameters definitely matters. But on the other hand, whether you can like effectively leverage the spectrum information matters for the performance as well. And all our
I'm
experiments. Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to ask as a follow-up to like this question about performance and your comments about size. I mean, so are there any problems in that graph neural networks are applied to at the moment where people are kind of investigating the kind of scale is all you need sort of style of machine learning going on in text and vision and video?
Yeah, there are some recent efforts. People try to build large benchmarks so that you can train a giant graph neural networks. But I guess the tricky part for graphs is the tasks are vastly different depending on the domain. Like if you work in the biology or chemistry related problems versus if you work on, say, computer vision related problems or other like language related problems, although they are all representing the graphs, the distribution of the graphs differ so much. So it may be very hard to expect a model that can excel at all these domains. So I think that's something people are trying to do. And in our
makes sense.
sorry, yeah, in our work, like we also try larger graph data sets like these zinc, most PCBA data sets are fairly large, but it still is it's not on the same magnitude of order compared to like data trained by GPT.
Someone else asked about applications of the diffusion model in symmetric groups. Could you maybe mention a few more applications or just remind us what the key applications were?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So we started this project as actually a vector intern project led by my intern and vector leak. So we didn't think too much about useful application, but I think some immediate application would be like, say, graph matching, because in graph matching, you want to find a permutation such that you can match one graph to the other. So then you can use such techniques for those problems. Yeah, but I don't have like a very mature thoughts about other applications for now.
So I'm not sure if you can see the chat, but there's a new question just popped up by Dan Wigglesworth asking, I see that SpecFormer achieves higher results in the benchmarks compared to other models, but what guided the novel approach? Is there a key theoretical insight or inspiration that made the difference for you?
Yeah, I think the key.
No.
Okay. So I think the key insights I have is for example here that so if you can see that all these graph properties basically depends not on single eigenvalue in the way that it depends on the relationship between eigenvalues. Even for like the Chigger's inequality, it seems that it depends on the second smallest eigenvalue alone. But in order to figure out which eigenvalue is the second smallest, you need to first rank all the eigenvalues. And the fact that you need to rank requires you to think about all these eigenvalues as a whole. So that motivates us to design this kind of side-to-side spectral filters. And I think that helps improve the performance a lot.
Another question we have.
Okay, I can see the chat now.
Yeah, there's this question. How do you imagine using models such as SpecFormer for large image synthesis, given that the adjacency matrices are large, even for small images?
Yeah, I think, yeah. Okay, yeah, so I guess for images, it's a very different problem that the graph is regular, it's a grid graph, and then it's very large because the number of pixels is large. And if you directly apply graph neural through images, it's doable, but I would doubt the performance would be better than convolutional or even transformer-based work. I mean, even for transformer-based work, you need to split the image into patches and then do the processing thereafter, because transformer can be viewed as special GNs, and then it's a fully collective graph under the tension. So I think transformers and GNs suffer from scalability when it comes to the data like images. So that's why I think in many cases you still need a convolutional neural network. And I know that in recent work, for example, diffusion transformer is popular, but still you see that in those work, they split the data into patches so that your token is not pixel level. And that could be enough for certain tasks, but again, why people want to do that is because of the scalability issue. So I would say like scalability issue is still a big problem for GNs and transformers if you want to work directly on the pixel level. Okay, I see another question. Use case. Oh, okay. I guess that question is more kind of like offline, have a specific use cases.
So Renjie, we have actually, as you know, we have a time with you booked after this talk for an open discussion.
Sure.
I see the kind of, I like to offer people the ability to maybe unmute, turn on their videos, et cetera, and start a discussion. I will unfortunately have to step away. I'm actually heading to the airport momentarily. I want to first thank you for coming and explaining this wide variety of work that you're working on. And I have some offline questions for you for the back-based stuff. Very interesting. So yeah, once again, thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah.